On a cold, rainy evening in the heart of downtown Chicago, as traffic lights flickered in rhythmic pulses, against wet asphalt and expensive cars glided through the puddles like silent sharks, a young black girl named Ayanna stood on the corner, across from Delancey's, the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. Her hands trembling, but her spine straight, her jacket soaked through and shoes worn thin, but her dignity intact as she watched the world pass her by without seeing her. And despite the ache in her stomach and the weight of responsibility pressing down on her 14-year-old shoulders, she refused to sit or slouch or look pitiful, because Ayanna wasn't raised to beg. She was raised to endure, to survive, and to protect, and right now her mission was her mother, who lay sick in their cramped shelter unit 3 blocks away, feverish and fading, with nothing but tap water in her belly and the memory of better days when Ayanna's father before he vanished would spin tales of Ghanaian warriors and feed them goat stew rich with love and spice. And it was that memory that pushed Ayanna across the slick sidewalk toward the glowing doors of Delancey's, where men in suits laughed over aged bourbon and women in heels clicked past her without a glance, and she stood waiting, breath visible, in the cold eyes scanning each patron exiting the restaurant, waiting for someone who didn't look angry or entitled or dismissive, someone who might hear her voice and not recoil. Until finally, a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out, adjusting his Rolex and checking his phone, his silver cufflinks gleaming under the awning lights. And Ayanna took one brave step forward and said, barely above a whisper, "Excuse me, sir, may I have your leftovers?" And just like that, the entire rhythm of the night cracked open, because the man, Elijah Cross, a billionaire venture capitalist known as the Shark of Chicago, a man who had built empires and ruined rivals and once fired an entire startup, bored in one afternoon, turned to dismiss her with the instinctive callousness born of wealth and insulation, but froze when his eyes met hers, because what he saw wasn't a beggar or a hustler or a lost cause, but fire-raw, young, unyielding. Fire that told of hunger, yes, but also of courage and of someone who still believed in something bigger than pain. And for reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, he said nothing, just stared, and then without a word, he turned back into the restaurant, leaving Ayanna confused and preparing herself for disappointment, until a minute later, he emerged not with a box of leftovers, but with the head chef behind him and a tray of hot, freshly prepared food that smelled like heaven and hope. And he knelt down and said, "I'm Elijah," his voice softer than anyone had heard in years. And when Ayanna reached for the tray with shaking hands, he added, "It's not just for you, it's for your mom, too. Let me help." And in that moment, a connection was formed not of pity, but of recognition, because Elijah, orphaned at 15 and raised in chaos, saw in Ayanna the ghost of his own past, the part he'd buried under years of power plays and cold deals, and Ayanna, sharp beyond her years, sensed something broken but kind beneath his polished exterior, and though she said thank you and turned to leave, he followed, holding an umbrella above them both as she led him down alleys and broken sidewalks to the shelter door. And when they arrived and he saw her mother, a woman once a teacher, now reduced by illness and circumstance, he did not flinch or look away, but knelt again, offering broth to her lips and listening to Ayanna explain how it had all fallen apart after her father disappeared during a factory strike. And Elijah didn't speak much that night, but he stayed until sunrise, watching over them both like a silent guardian. And before he left, he slipped a card into Ayanna's hand with the words, "Call me if you ever need anything," and a number written in neat script. And though she didn't fully understand what had just happened, Ayanna knew this night had changed something, that a door had opened, one she hadn't even dared to knock on, and behind it stood not a savior, but a chance. The next time she saw him, the wind carried the scent of autumn through the cracked sidewalk, rustling the last stubborn leaves on the old sycamores that lined the avenue where she walked Malik home from school. His small hand, warm in hers, chattering about his art project, while Kayla's mind wandered to a face she didn't expect to see again, a memory stitched with sunlight and engine grease and the rare warmth of being helped without strings. And just as she was reminding herself not to hope for what wasn't promised, she heard that same calm voice, real and steady, say, "Looks." Like the champ made it through another day, and she turned, startled, to see Elijah leaning against the hood of his truck, smile wide, clothes dusted with drywall and paint. Hands still bearing the story of an honest day's work, and Malik lit up like a light bulb, breaking into a run with a cry of Mr. Fix-It. Before launching into Elijah's arms like they'd known each other for years, not just minutes, and Kayla stood frozen, heart tight in her chest. Not from fear, but from the ache of watching her son cling to a man who radiated the steady kind of presence Malik had never known. And when Elijah looked at her over Malik's shoulder, his expression wasn't one of pity or intrusion, but quiet question. Was it okay he was there? And she nodded slowly, as though giving permission to something larger than a conversation. And they walked together, the three of them, down the narrow street toward the community garden where Malik liked to play. And with each step, Kayla found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, her shoulders slowly unwinding as Elijah asked questions that showed he listened, not just heard. And when she told him about her second job cleaning offices at night, he didn't respond with a lecture about finding better work or tell her she was strong for doing it. All he just asked what kind of music she listened to get through the long hours. And when she said Motown, his eyes lit up and he hummed a few lines from the Temptations. And before she knew it, they were sitting on a cracked bench while Malik dug for imaginary treasure nearby. And the conversation dipped deeper, not into trauma or pain, but into dreams, things she'd buried so deep she'd barely recognized them anymore. How she once loved to sketch, how she wanted to finish her associate's degree, how she dreamed of taking Malik to the ocean someday so he could see something bigger than the city skyline. And Elijah listened, like none of it was silly or impossible. Like every dream she named was a seed waiting to bloom. And when dusk began to fall, and she realized it was past dinner, she hesitated, unsure of how to end this without closing the door on it forever. But Elijah stood, looked her in the eye, and said gently, "I'm not here to rush anything, Kayla. I just see something good, and I'm willing to show up if that's okay with you." And she didn't know what to say, so she nodded, and over the next week, he did just that, showed up not every hour, not in grand gestures, but in small, steady ways, dropping off a bag of groceries with no note, fixing her porch light without being asked, helping Malik with his math homework on the stoop after school while she made dinner. And with every act, Kayla felt something inside her uncoil, a permission to trust again, to believe that kindness could be consistent, and that maybe her story wasn't over yet, and the night it shifted was cold and clear. With Malik asleep under a borrowed Star Wars blanket on the couch, and Kayla standing at the sink, scrubbing dishes when Elijah walked in, smelling of fresh paint and cedar, carrying a small container of chili he'd made from a recipe his grandmother taught him. And when she laughed and said it smelled better than anything she'd had in weeks, he smiled, leaned on the counter, and asked gently, "You ever let anyone take care of you?" And her hands froze in the dishwater because no one ever had, not really, and the words caught in her throat. But she didn't look away, and neither did he. And the silence between them filled with the unspoken truth that care wasn't weakness, and trust wasn't foolish, and maybe, just maybe, this was what the beginning of safety felt like. And as the clock ticked on and Malik snored softly in the background, Kayla sat beside Elijah at the tiny kitchen table, and for the first time in years she let someone stay. And when he finally stood to leave, lingering in the doorway, he turned and said, "Good night, Kayla. You're doing more than surviving. I hope you know that." And her heart broke open a little more. And when she closed the door behind him, she didn't feel alone, just quiet, as though something sacred had been spoken between them without needing to be said. And the next day, when Malik asked if Elijah was coming back, she didn't hesitate. She just said, "I hope so." And the hope wasn't scary anymore. It was real. Because maybe this time, the story wouldn't end the way the others had. Maybe this time, it was just beginning. The days that followed Elijah's quiet promise unfolded with the kind of tenderness that wrapped around Kayla's guarded heart like sunlight through the window after a long winter. Each moment laced with care, patience, and the kind of fierce, gentle persistence that only comes from someone determined to build something sacred, not rushed or borrowed, but real, earned, and lasting. And in the weeks that followed that Saturday, when she asked the question that had haunted her since Malik was born, "Do you want to be his father?" Elijah did not disappear into the comfort of those words, did not assume them as permission or possession, but instead showed up more deeply, more intentionally, like a man watering seeds he intended to grow with his own hands. And every day, became a ritual, not of grand gestures, but of presence, of peeling back the quiet layers of trust Kayla had spent years protecting. And it began with mornings. When she would find him outside their building at 7 a.m., warming up her car or fixing the squeaky door on the laundry room without being asked, and Malik would rush into his arms like he'd been gone for weeks, always with a new drawing or joke or question about tools and trucks and superhero movies, and Elijah would listen with the patience of a saint, never rushing him, never speaking over him, always meeting him on his level like he was the most important person in the world. And Kayla began to notice that the smiles she wore weren't performed but lived in, and that the weight on her shoulders felt less like a burden and more like something shared, because Elijah didn't try to rescue her or fix her life. He just stood beside her, solid and ready, and on evenings when the bills were tight or the groceries low, he didn't hand her cash or pity. He brought over stew he'd made or took Malik out for ice cream so she could rest. Or he stayed up late helping her build her online portfolio so she could finally apply to those architecture firms she'd only dreamed of. And it was during those nights, when their knees touched under the table, heads bent over blueprints and resumes, that she felt something else rising inside her, something she hadn't dared give voice to in years. Hope. And slowly, Elijah became more than a helper or a friend. He became a rhythm in their lives, a heartbeat they leaned into. And one night, as rain tapped against the windows and Kayla tucked Malik into bed, she heard him whisper, "Mom, when is Elijah going to be my dad?" For real. And her breath caught because she didn't know how to answer. Didn't know how to explain that love like this true, careful, earned took time. But when she told Elijah what Malik said, he didn't panic or pull back. He just smiled softly and said, "Tell him I'm working on it." And Kayla, overwhelmed by the steadiness of this man, felt her walls crumble a little more. And that weekend, Elijah took them to a community garden he volunteered at, showed Malik how to plant tomatoes and build compost bins, and afterward they lay on a picnic blanket as the sun set. Malik curled between them, and Kayla felt Elijah's hand find hers, his thumb gently tracing the scar on her wrist from the time she'd burned herself cooking during a blackout. And in that moment, it wasn't passion or desire that passed between them, it was safety, the kind of love that asked nothing but gave everything. And one night, as she looked at the photos Elijah had taken of Malik at the garden, she realized she couldn't remember life before his smile lit up their days, couldn't imagine mornings without his voice in the hallway, or nights without his quiet strength at her side. And she remembered how afraid she had been to ask that question, to speak the fragile truth of her heart. But now she understood that love, real love, wasn't a leap, but a series of steps, walked in honesty and time. And as autumn settled over the city, and leaves turned gold and crimson, their home felt different, not because of furniture or decor, but because it was filled with laughter, with warmth, with the smell of pancakes Elijah made on Sundays, and the quiet guitar songs he played for Malik before bed. And one night, after Malik had fallen asleep listening to Elijah hum old soul songs in the next room, Kayla turned to him on the couch, tears in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sheer immensity of gratitude. And she whispered, "I don't know how you got here, but I thank God every day that you did." And Elijah looked at her, his eyes full of that same quiet strength that had carried them this far, and said, "I didn't get here by accident. Kayla was sent, and though she didn't believe in fairy tales, didn't expect life to ever be easy, in that moment, she knew that even if storms came, even if the road ahead was hard, they'd walk it together, step by step, because what they were building wasn't just a family, it was a future rooted in love, chosen freely, grown with care, and nourished. By every moment, they chose each other over and over again. The journey wasn't perfect, no fairy tale ever. His Aunt Kayla had long given up on the fantasy of flawless endings. But what grew between them was far richer than fiction could ever script, and it unfolded not in grand declarations or sweeping moments, but in the honest, often messy, always meaningful rhythm of real life, where Elijah didn't move in with boxers and fanfare, but slowly, with presence, with the kind of steady involvement that didn't need to announce itself because it was already felt, in the way Malik began calling him first when his shoelaces were tangled, or how Kayla no longer instinctively carried every burden alone, and it started to show in the softening of her voice, the easing of her shoulders, the spontaneous laughter. that returned after years of being buried under stress and single-parent exhaustion. And though they never rushed things, each moment wove deeper threads into the tapestry of their bond. From Elijah showing up to Malik's first-grade parent-teacher night, where he sat front row and beamed like the boy's very existence was his proudest achievement, to weekend mornings when they cooked pancakes as a trio, each flipping spatula passed like a family heirloom in a kitchen that now smelled like cinnamon and joy, instead of silence and sacrifice. And it wasn't just the big milestones, though those mattered too, but the countless quiet victories that stitched their lives together. Elijah waiting patiently while Malik melted down over a lost toy, or Kayla discovering Elijah had fixed the leaky faucet that had nagged her for months. Not because she asked, but because he noticed, and over time, the unspoken question that had hovered like a breath held in the air, "Are we really doing this?" answered itself not in words, but in the consistency of showing up, the sacred repetition of choosing each other again and again. And Kayla, once afraid to dream too far ahead, began to sketch out blueprints, not just for houses, but for a future, where she might go back to school, where her talents in design could be more than a side hustle squeezed between motherhood and exhaustion. Because Elijah not only encouraged her, he believed in her with a quiet conviction that made her believe too. And when she applied to an architecture program she'd shelved years ago, he was the first to celebrate, the one who showed up with flowers from Malik, hand-drawn card and all, and she cried, not because of the acceptance letter, but because of what it represented, the rebuilding of a life, one brick of belief at a time. And through it all, they navigated the rough patches, nights of doubt, moments of miscommunication, the occasional clash of histories and habits with grace, never perfect, but always rooted in respect. And then, one rainy Sunday morning, Malik came tearing into the living room, arms flailing with excitement, holding up a lopsided craft project made at church school, shouting, "Dad, look what I made." And the word hung there for a heartbeat, reverberating like a gong struck in a cathedral of silent hopes. And Elijah froze not out of fear, but reverence before swooping Malik up in his arms with a grin that said, without hesitation, "Yes, I'm yours," and across the room. Kayla watched with tears. She didn't try to hide, because that single word, that unconscious gift of trust from her son, was the very answer they hadn't known they needed. And Elijah's eyes met hers across the space, filled not with questions, but with a quiet, eternal yes. And in that look, in that moment, there was no need for rings or ceremonies or titles written in ink. What they had was older and truer than any contract, a family built from devotion, from consistency, from the radical, transformative act of simply staying. And as the rain slid down the windows like the sky exhaling its own relief, Kayla sat beside them on the couch, their son in Elijah's lap, their future in the warmth of that room, and knew that somehow, against the odds and despite the scars, they had created something sacred, not born of obligation or convenience, but of chosen love, forged not in fantasy, but in the fire of daily life. And she reached out, resting her head on Elijah's shoulder, breathing in the smell of rain and syrup and home, and whispered the truth that had lived in her chest for weeks now. Unspoken but undeniable, "You are his father," and Elijah, without looking away from the boy, dozing against his chest, simply replied, "I always have been." And there, wrapped in the echo of that truth, in the simplicity of shared breath and 3 steady heartbeats, they existed not as what they'd once been, but as what they had become, a family, not defined by blood, but by the sacred commitment to love, protect, and build together. And as the rain fell outside and the world continued rushing by, inside that small apartment was the stillness of something whole, something real, something utterly unbreakable.